Calling RESTful web services. To call web services, you'll need to write code or have a tool that can make HTTP requests. You need a tool that's able to specify the HTTP method, request headers, and a request body when necessary. Some tools, one in particular is a command line utility called curl that's very popular. In these examples, we'll be using Postman for Google Chrome. And there's a lot of other great REST clients out there like Advanced REST Client. Making calls to RESTful APIs. We're going to have two types of APIs we may need to call. One of which is an unsecured API. This is an API that may be public and not require any authentication. And then lastly, a secured API. And this API could be secured and require some type of auth. You may need to provide credentials and/or a token. Oftentimes, there's some type of proxy that is used to govern access to the backend API. We will call and then later create an API secured by credentials. And you could also secure an API with other authentication protocols outside of just client credentials, things like OAuth, SAML, JSON Web Tokens, and more. Now, we also have to concern ourselves with the responses we get back. RESTful web services return an HTTP status code with the response. These status codes provide the client feedback for the outcome of the operation. Did it succeed? Did it fail? Was something created? And so on. A good API should return status codes that align with the HTTP spec. This way the client can better understand what happened with its request. Some status code examples that are quite common. 200, probably the most common. It typically represents OK that your request was successful. It can be found on all different types of methods like get, delete, patch, and put. 201 created oftentimes represents that a new resource or object was created. This is most commonly seen when doing a post request to a collection. 304 not modified, saying that nothing on the request was modified, and then some error codes in the 400 range, like 400 bad request, 401 unauthorized, another very common one, 404, if the resource being requested wasn't found. And then finally, a more generic server error, 500, if something went wrong server side. So now let's hop into our next walkthrough. We've seen a lot of APIs in the platform, but let's try making some calls to actual APIs and see what data we get back. In this example, we'll use Postman to make calls to an unsecured API. We will make get, delete, post, and put calls. And we'll use Postman to make calls to a secured API, an API proxy. Let's get started. For this next walkthrough, you may also want to keep your snippets file around, as we're going to be referencing it throughout. We'll start off by opening up Postman. And once Postman starts up, let's go ahead and attempt to send a request through. One of the requests in our student files is the apdev American Web Service.cloudhub.io. Let's copy that whole URL and paste it inside of Postman. Now in this case, Postman will do a GET request to this address. Let's hit send. Now we'll notice a couple things here. One is that we got a status 200 back. And secondly, if we scroll through, we can see that we received a list of flights back in the JSON response. Now I've popped Postman full screen, and I'm going to select the params box here to see if we can filter out some of the items that are coming back in the result set. In the parameters box, we can insert a key and a value. In this case, let's say that we want to sort or filter rather by the code CLE, only getting flights back, as you can see in the URI here, where the code is CLE. We'll hit send again. And once we get a response back, if we scroll through, we can see that this URI has produced just flights to Cleveland in this case. Now let's go ahead and clear out the parameter by hitting the X next to it. And let's change the request URI slightly. Let's say in this whole list of flights, we just want to get the third flight specifically. Well, we'll go ahead and do /3, representing that we want flight 3 out of the flights collection, and hit send. Now in your response, you can see that you've just got a single flight that has been returned to you in this case. Now, this REST API being fully functioning, it doesn't just give you information, but might let you alter it. So let's pretend for a moment that you want to be able to delete Flight 3. Well, to delete Flight 3, all we need to do is drop down this box in Postman and say that we want to access the same URI, but this time using the delete method. Let's send the delete request through. And you can see we get a different response here saying flight deleted. Now, as a warning, this doesn't actually remove the flight from the system, but it is going to provide a different area of the code that gets access to cause this delete to occur, allowing for a different piece of functionality. Now let's change it up even more. Let's say, hypothetically, we accidentally wanted to do a delete request, but we forgot to put in the specific flight we wanted to delete. Well, in this case, if we hit send on flights, we'll see it pushes back at us and says, hey, this method is not allowed. So somewhere in the API developer decided that deletes on the flight resource would not be acceptable to this system. Now that we've seen gets and deletes, let's flip over to a post request. We'll go ahead and click this post button, and inside of the post to flights, let's hit send. Now in this specific case, we're getting some type of exception back from the client. Most commonly, if the API is fully implemented, it's going to go out and it's going to provide us a response back that would say something like 415 for an unsupported media type. In this case, there's an exception that's being fed back to the client. Later in this class, you're going to learn how to take these exceptions and provide better responses back than just this raw data about what went wrong in the system. Now, effectively, this is letting us know, hey, you need to put a specific media type and body into this request. So let's see if we can do that now. In the headers tab of Postman, let's go ahead and specify our own content type in here. And the content type that we will say we're posting will be application JSON. Now, since we're doing a post, we now have the ability to put a body into the request. And let's try that now. We'll click the body tab and make sure you have the raw button selected in here. When you click raw, it's likely that it will be a completely empty box here. If not, feel free to delete whatever pre-exists. And in this case, let's see if we can put a request body inside. So if we go to our snippets file one more time and copy the American Flights API post body into Postman, now let's try sending this post through. This time when we send with a content type and a body, we get a different response. Notably, this time we actually received a 201, which, as you might recall, represents a new resource was created. Instead of an error, we now get flight added, but not really, back to our client. So let's say we want to switch this up a little bit. Let's say we don't necessarily want to specify a plain type inside of here. So let's go ahead and remove plain type from the JSON body. In order for the JSON to be valid, we'd then have to remove the final empty seat inside of here. And we could try posting again. Now, you'll see the exact same response came back and everything looks healthy. So apparently that parameter, or fields rather, that we deleted were not necessarily required by the API or system. Now, what if we were more abrasive? What if we actually removed the empty seat count when we tried to post a flight? So we'll delete empty seats, get rid of the comma on destination this time, and let's send the request in. Now we can see we got a response back saying bad request. So the API realized that we did not put in empty seats and came back to our client saying, you have a 400 bad request, meaning there was something wrong with your request. Now let's switch it up from post and let's do one more with a put command. So we'll drop down post, we'll go to put. And in the case of put, we wouldn't want to replace or update the entire collection of flights. We'd want to just do one. So let's go ahead and add back a specific ID for a flight. Now, if we go ahead and hit the send button inside of put, we'll once again see that we still get a bad request. Now let's see if we can make this put work. So if we do some undos, Command or Control Z, and get back our original request body, let's hit send again. And now we can see a response coming back saying flight updated. Note the subtle difference between put and post. The put came back with a 200 because it didn't create anything new, and the post came back with a 201, representing that something new did occur. All right, now let's change this up altogether. Let's go ahead and switch back to a GET request. And this time around, let's call a slightly different endpoint. Going back to our student files for a moment, let's copy the American Flights API URL. We'll copy that into our clipboard, head back to Postman, and we'll paste that URL in and do a simple GET request against it. Now, right when you receive this response back, you're going to see that we got a 401 unauthorized. That means this specific API we're calling now is clearly locked down. If we look at our response message, it's also clear that we have some type of client ID and/or client secret setup going on where we need to specify those parameters. Now, let's see if we can get these parameters in. If we go back to our student files for a second and check out the snippets, we're going to see that there is both an American Flights API client ID and also a client secret. Let's start off by copying the client ID. And inside of Postman, we're going to go back to the params. And in params, let's put in a client ID. So it adds in this query parameter with our value. And be careful here. You want to make sure that you're doing this under params. If you have the headers box open in the bottom, you don't want to be entering it inside of there. So again, that's client ID and up here. And you should see it append it to the end of the URI in the top. We'll do client secret. Head back to the student snippets, copy that, and paste it in. Now let's see what happens when we do a GET request. If we send the GET request through, we can now see the body of data is coming back, and we're in fact getting a 200 OK response, meaning we are clearly authenticating successfully. Once again, if we ask for flights 1, we can see a more specific response come back for just that flight. All right, so now we've been able to call a unauthenticated API with multiple different methods. We've been able to call a API that is locked down with client ID and client secret, and we've been able to get past that and get a valid response back as well.